China didn't rescue the world with one dramatic announcement, but several quiet decisions recently helped prevent global problems from becoming worse. That sounds like a bold claim, especially when China is usually discussed as a source of tension, debt, pollution, or economic risk. Yet the picture is more complicated because the same country creating pressure in one area can reduce it in another. The question isn't whether China suddenly became a global hero. It didn't. The real question is what China did, why it mattered beyond its borders, and who benefited quietly. By the end, you'll see how trade, energy, manufacturing, and diplomacy connected into one much larger story. There's a final complication. Some of the moves that helped stabilize the world also increased China's use over it. That contradiction is the key to understanding what happened. Start with the most visible effect. China continued pushing goods, components, and industrial capacity into a world that badly needed them. When supply chains are under pressure, the first signs rarely look dramatic. A shipment arrives late, a factory waits for parts, and a familiar product suddenly becomes more expensive. Those small delays spread through transportation, construction, consumer electronics, medical equipment, and energy systems, while China remains deeply embedded in each of those networks, which means its production decisions affect far more than Chinese buyers. When Chinese factories keep operating and exports keep moving, the immediate effect can be lower prices and fewer shortages elsewhere. That isn't charity. It is the result of China's industrial scale, export incentives, and dependence on overseas markets, but motives and consequences aren't always the same thing. A company can pursue its own advantage and still provide relief to millions of people it never intended to help. That is where the phrase "quietly saved" becomes useful, but only if we treat it carefully. China may not have solved the world's problems, yet it has often kept certain problems from becoming more expensive. The first major example is manufacturing capacity for clean energy. China produces a dominant share of the world's solar panels and a large portion of the batteries used in electric vehicles and energy storage. That concentration creates legitimate concerns about dependence, competition, and strategic vulnerability. But it also means that the global transition away from fossil fuels would be slower and more costly without Chinese production. Solar panels become useful only when they can be produced in enormous numbers and installed at prices ordinary economies can afford. The same logic applies to batteries, electric buses, grid equipment, and many of the components behind renewable power, because China's advantage comes from more than cheap labor. Automation, supplier networks, infrastructure, and technical experience now reinforce one another. A battery maker benefits from nearby chemical suppliers, specialist engineers, shipping links, and customers large enough to absorb production. That creates a system other countries are trying to rebuild. But systems like this take years to reproduce. So when Chinese production expands, clean technology can reach more markets faster than it otherwise would. Here's the uncomfortable part. The world wants the benefits of Chinese manufacturing without becoming dependent on China. Those goals can conflict. The United States, Europe, India, and other economies are investing in their own factories, partly to reduce that dependence. But building alternative capacity takes money, trained workers, raw materials, and time. Until those alternatives mature, Chinese factories remain part of the bridge between today's energy system and tomorrow's. That may be one reason the world can criticize Beijing's methods while still relying on its output. And this tension isn't limited to climate technology, because it appears throughout the global economy, where rising inflation reaches consumers through food, transport, heating, and household goods. More supply can reduce those pressures, even when the supplier is politically controversial. China's manufacturing system has therefore acted as both a source of competition and a source of relief. To understand why, look at the scale of the network rather than one company or one product, because factories depend on ports, railways, power stations, logistics firms, banks, engineers, and layers of smaller suppliers. That network allows production to continue when individual companies face setbacks. It also allows China to redirect output toward new markets when demand changes. This flexibility can protect consumers from sudden disruption. It can also overwhelm competitors. And that brings us to the second part of the story: China's role in global trade routes. For decades, China built its economy around exporting manufactured goods and importing energy, food, technology, and raw materials, which made global shipping central to China's own survival. If trade collapses, China suffers too. That gives Beijing a reason to keep commercial channels open even during political disputes, while the world has recently faced wars, sanctions, shipping disruptions, and rising uncertainty across major transport routes. No single country controls those risks. China can't simply remove them, but continued Chinese demand and continued Chinese exports can keep pressure from spreading through every market at once. China's factories purchase huge amounts of materials from other countries, while its exports supply customers across Asia, Africa, Europe, and the Americas, and that creates a web of mutual dependence, even between governments that distrust one another. Trade doesn't erase conflict. It raises the cost of allowing conflict to destroy every connection. That is why economic activity can sometimes function as a stabilizer without anyone calling it one. Here's how the local news covered the pressure on trade routes and the scramble to keep goods moving. The clip matters because it shows the difference between political headlines and daily logistics. Governments may argue over tariffs, security, and strategic influence, while companies still need containers delivered on schedule. That practical need keeps a channel open even when diplomacy is frozen. But the same channel creates a vulnerability, because if too much production, processing, or shipping capacity sits in one country, disruption there can become a worldwide problem. China's quiet contribution is therefore also a quiet warning. The world has benefited from concentrated efficiency, but it has paid for that efficiency with concentrated risk. The third piece is energy security. China is the world's largest energy consumer, and its choices affect global fuel markets, whether other governments approve of them or not. When Chinese demand rises, oil, gas, coal, and industrial materials can become more expensive internationally. When demand weakens, exporters feel the pressure, and prices can move in the opposite direction. That means China's economy acts like a large control signal inside the global energy system. The signal isn't always predictable, especially when property weakness, manufacturing changes, or government stimulus affect consumption. Still, China's rapid expansion of renewable power has changed the long-term balance. The country has built enormous solar and wind capacity, expanded electric transport, and invested heavily in batteries and grid infrastructure. Those projects don't erase coal use overnight. China remains heavily dependent on fossil fuels. That contradiction shouldn't be hidden. China can be the world's biggest builder of clean energy equipment, while also being one of the largest users of coal. Both facts are true at the same time. The more useful question is what happens to global emissions and energy prices when renewable capacity grows at Chinese scale, even if China's motives are industrial and strategic, because the added equipment can help other countries reduce dependence on imported fuel. That matters for countries exposed to price shocks, shipping disruptions, and currency pressure. A solar farm doesn't need fuel deliveries every week, and an electric bus doesn't depend on imported diesel for every route. Those changes can make energy systems more resilient, though they also create new dependence on minerals and manufacturing networks. People immediately took to social media when Chinese electric vehicles and energy products appeared in markets far beyond East Asia. The reactions say everything. Some viewers saw cheaper technology, while others saw a strategic challenge arriving on wheels. That split isn't a side issue, it is the central conflict. A product can be useful to consumers and disruptive to industries at the same time. Batteries can stabilize grids, while the supply chain behind them raises questions about mining, labor, and strategic control. The world's quiet benefit may arrive bundled with a new political argument. The fourth part of this story is diplomacy, and China has used its economic relationships to maintain contact with governments that Western powers often struggle to reach. That doesn't mean Beijing is a neutral mediator or that every diplomatic effort succeeds. It means China has access, incentives, and influence that other countries sometimes lack. In a fragmented world, access itself can become valuable. China has relationships. Across Asia, the Middle East, Africa, Latin America, and Europe, those relationships are often built around trade, infrastructure, energy, loans, and technology, while critics argue that this creates dependence and some governments have pushed back against Chinese terms or projects. Supporters argue that China offers financing and infrastructure where other powers offer lectures or delays. Both arguments can contain truth. Depending on the project and the country involved, China's diplomacy can reduce tension in one situation while increasing its bargaining power in another. And that's why simplistic stories fail. But use isn't the same as leadership. Leadership implies trust. While use can operate through necessity, this distinction matters because China's global role is expanding faster than global confidence in China. Listen to what the official statement said when China presented itself as a voice for dialogue. The words are carefully chosen, but the strategy behind them is easier to see. A country that wants greater influence doesn't need everyone to admire it. It needs other governments to believe that talking to it is necessary. That belief gives Beijing use during crises, negotiations, and economic disputes. But use isn't the same as leadership. Leadership implies trust, while use can operate through necessity. This distinction matters because China's global role is expanding faster than global confidence in China.